So on behalf of the Climate Justice team, I want to welcome you all and thank you for joining our March webinar as we continue our journey towards the goal of flourishing of life for all. This month there will be 2 weeks between this webinar and our follow-up conversation on April 3rd, which will be at the same time as today. But in place of a webinar in April, the team will be participating in the Beyond the Walls online worship service on Sunday, April 24th. The theme is God's Shalom for all creation. Please note that this is a different time than our normal activities. The website is www.centerplace.ca, and please note that's the Canadian spelling of center. We'll get all the time zones figured out soon. Moving to daylight time has been a bit of a challenge with that. Last fall, we briefly introduced the topic of eco-racism by Randy Litzenberger, talking about how it's primarily minority ethnic groups, that I can talk, what we now call BIPOC people. That means Black, Indigenous, and people of color in North America and elsewhere, who live in areas of cities most prone to the effects of climate change. And then last month, Ashia Ajani led us through an introduction and opening of our hearts and minds to the historical and ongoing oppression experienced primarily by the Black and Indigenous communities in America. This month, we go deeper into eco-racism or environmental racism. This is not something that's new. It's been happening for centuries. It's broad, it's multidimensional, it's complex. What is new and urgent is the ways in which climate change is disproportionately affecting communities already struggling with systemic, environmental, and economic oppression. Broad will explore the roots of this issue in colonialism, and we will share stories of communities being impacted today. There will be limited time for questions partway through. But first, let's begin with a definition of what eco-racism is. Coined in the 1970s, the classic definition is that environmental racism is intentional or unintentional racial discrimination in environmental policymaking, enforcement of regulations and laws, and the targeting of communities for the disposal of toxic waste and siting of polluting industries. There's a lot to unpack in that definition. There are so many powerful and tragic stories of environmental degradation. However, this is a much broader subject than the initial definition implies. It includes economic suppression, biodiversity loss, food insecurity, and the impact several generations down the road of people having been forced from their ancestral lands with a resulting disconnect from their spiritual, cultural, and health benefits provided by that connection. We'll briefly explore why it is primarily BIPOC peoples who are most adversely affected by the increasing instances of extreme heat and flooding. Today marks a new experiment for the team, being presenters as well as hosts. This brings with it logistical and technical learning curves, so we ask for your patience and grace if things don't go quite the way we planned. And now Susan will guide us through our first story of eco-racism.
There we go. Thank you, Joan. I appreciate that. Recently, I listened to a podcast that was created by Greenpeace featuring a, featuring Ajua Adai, who was born in Jamaica and was sharing with me in that podcast about environmental injustice in the Caribbean. It's the first in a series of podcasts on eco-racism, and I highly recommend it. I will later put the link in the chat box for anybody who's interested. The podcast spoke of sacrifice zones, places where life, culture, and the earth have been sacrificed in order to extract resources, build industries, or deposit waste. In sacrifice zones, both the people and the health of the earth are considered of little worth. Residents are exposed to disproportionately high levels of toxic contamination in the air, water, and soil. Animal species decline and die, and the earth itself suffers. The islands of the South Pacific include multiple sacrifice zones. Many people of my generation are aware of the nuclear islands created between 1946 and 1958 during the testing of the atomic bomb. My father was one of the Operation Red Wing test pilots who flew a plane into the radioactive cloud after a bomb had been exploded on Inuiatak of the Marshall Islands. Although the plane faltered and failed, my father was able to restart the engine and make a safe landing. Not only was Inuiatak destroyed in the experiments, but so were multiple islands where waste and topsoil were mixed with concrete to create nuclear waste repositories such as Runit Island, the so-called tomb, which is now eroding and threatening a radioactive leak into the surrounding area. These Marshall Islands are well-known sacrifice zones, but most sacrifice zones sink out of consciousness, are invisible, or suffer from plausible deniability. If we once knew they existed, we've dismissed them because it doesn't affect us. It affects ethnic communities who are also invisible to us, like Makatea of French Polynesia. In the late 1800s, the French who ruled French Polynesia discovered rich phosphate deposits on the pleasant island of Makatea. The people there made a living selling coconut products and crabs. With the discovery of phosphate, their lives and livelihoods changed dramatically. Phosphate is used in fertilizer, munitions, manufacturing, cosmetics, electronics, cleaning supplies. It's used in meats, processed food, and fast food production. Ajua Adai says that one of the major differences between indigenous communities and colonizing privileged cultures is patience. Both cultures value the treasures embedded in rock and soil. But indigenous people are content to wait for the earth to erode down over time, to gradually reveal gems and minerals, which they use sparingly and treasure all the more. Dominant luxury cultures, on the other hand, cannot wait for the earth to gently yield its hidden resources. They dig down, strip mining, extracting gems and minerals out of time and order. It's a violent, penetrative process, disrupting the harmony of nature. Furthermore, the end product is valued more highly than the raw resources. Refined fuel is more precious than crude oil. Cut diamonds are more expensive than raw gems. Those extracting the resources are also seen as raw material, of less value than those who use the finished product. Indigenous people are being consumed by cravings for luxury goods. So it was on Makatea where the British Phosphate Company became interested in mineral deposits in 1906. 5 years later, a conglomerate corporation formed by French, British, and German industrialists moved onto the island. They employed thousands of Polynesians, Japanese, Chinese, and Vietnamese, mostly indentured laborers. 11 million tons of phosphate-rich sand was dug by hand out of naturally occurring limestone cylinders, each averaging 8 feet wide and 50 to 75 feet deep. A miner was lowered into the hole, filled buckets with sand, and his teammates hauled them up and wheeled them away. To extend their reach into the extraction zone, men built ramps out of wooden boards. At first, the company used small locomotives and carts to move phosphate from the site of extraction. Later, they built an elaborate conveyor belt that spanned almost half of the island. The raw phosphate traveled down to Port Tomeo Wharf, where European ships waited to export it. There was a company town which buzzed with over 3,000 people at its height in the 1960s. The mining conglomerate worked the land hard and fast from 1917 to 1966, and they worked the Polynesian and Asian laborers equally hard. Over the years, there were labor disputes about conditions and wages, and rock dust caused grave illness and death. When the phosphate petered out, the Europeans packed up their things and walked out, leaving everything just as it was. Within a few months, the island's population dropped from 3,000 to less than 100. France needed skilled workers for the infamous nuclear testing site on Mururoa Atoll. Those who were willing went there, an expendable resource transported to another sacrifice zone. But that's a story for another day. Let's return to Makatea. The mining conglomerate left with no remediation of the land. Empty tubes of rock remain to this day, over 1 million treacherous holes. Rail cars and machinery rusted in place. Dormitories and administration buildings deteriorated. Battered by storms and sea, Tomeo Wharf broke apart. Only a few concrete bulwarks remain. For several miles around Makatea, the poisoned water killed all sea life, while the tailings from the mines killed wildlife and plant life on the hills. Makatea was left on its own, with only a few families left to eke out a living on the island. I visited our Community of Christ congregation on Makatea in 2012, 10 years ago. The extraction zone had begun to recover after nearly 50 years of nature's healing arts. Green vegetation grew sparsely among the mining holes. Scraggly pandanus trees have gained a foothold and grow in the scorching heat. But pandanus roots often come loose if humans lean against them. There is no depth to the soil. Away from the extraction zone, Makatea has an abundance of fresh water, which is extremely rare in the Tuamotu's low-lying atolls. Coconut palms have taken root in the phosphate-rich soil, and once again, harvesting copra, coconut meat, can provide a reasonable livelihood. Some of the hardiest fish have begun to come back into the waters, though biodiversity is limited, and with them came some intrepid fisherfolk. Makatea also has endemic birds. Some Makatea coconut crabs survived through the years, the world's largest and most aggressive land invertebrate. The crabs are smaller now than they once were, but they are the foundation for a thriving export business to Tahiti and other islands. In 2012, a small community of around 50 had grown up on the island. Some islanders had started a tourist business, which has since flourished. Makatea is slowly and surely being resurrected without human help. But the residents want to be part of the healing. They wish to lend their own hands and energy to cleansing the island of poisons and reclaiming its beauty. They were discussing options among themselves about what could be done to mitigate the effects of the old mining. In 2012, there was a way forward, a plan for restoring Makatea. Experience has shown us that indigenous wisdom can provide excellent answers to local ecological problems. But since then, a variety of solutions have been proposed by experts around the world. Just as Europeans marched in and dominated indigenous cultures to begin with, so European problem solvers tend to march in and propose solutions without consulting or involving the populations that are most affected. In the case of Makatea, such help has resulted in a decade of delay. One more example of eco-racism, negating indigenous wisdom in favor of outside solutions that may benefit the dominant population more than the indigenous community. Makatea is only one example of a sacrifice zone. Believe it or not, the story doesn't end there. But I will pause to allow Rod the opportunity to share with you a brief definition and history of colonialism, the perspective that underlies environmental injustice, eco-racism, and sacrifice zones. Rod?
Okay, colonialism in 15 minutes. Doing 500 years in 15 minutes, that should be an easy job. Like a lot of topics that we do here, they easily could be sessions in and of themselves, and this is one of them. So this is going to be primarily just refreshing your minds about what you probably or hopefully have learned either from your childhood or later, and we'll see how that goes. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Even as a Canadian, I think most of us learned that rhyme. Now, what I want to do today is not just go through a kind of a dry history, but more of a narrative history. I learned that line. I learned the lessons that were available in the 60s, I guess it would have been late 50s and 60s. And one of the things I've come to appreciate is that historians, for a number of reasons, everything from technology, carbon dating, and DNA analysis, finding new fragments and sacred writings and such, they have been able to go back over that history that I learned with that rhyme and get a clearer picture. For me, this has been exciting to have that original worldview that I had. You know, here, my heritage was English and such. You know, we brought all this goodness to the world. It was a wonderful thing that we did. And not discounting that there was some very good people and some good things that happened, that overall it has resulted in people like me being at the top, you know, of the world heap, and a whole bunch of people being at the bottom. And it is a self-reinforcing mechanism. So let's take a look at some of those things, some of the things that, yes, if you're open to, can be quite exciting, because you can see the connections that can be made to that better world, that flourishing of life. Now, even back when I was a kid, I did know that there were, and pardon the word, but that was the word used, Indian reserves in the 1960s. And so even back then, there was a bit of a disconnect. Gee, if we did so much good, why are there these Indian reserves that they just seem to be impoverished, yet they're sitting in Canada? Didn't have any answers to that. And again, that's why I'm glad historians and dialogue, rather than just talking about those Indians, we started to learn to dialogue with, and realize, well, that's actually kind of a pejorative term, and let's call them indigenous peoples instead, as an example. Okay, I made up another rhyme. Not a very good one. In 1942, all Muslims out of Spain the Spaniards threw. I don't know whether you knew that. I didn't. Definitely didn't learn that. But it's true. The point being that when colonialism started during this period, that was when the Inquisition happened. That was when, as this little diddly that I made up, that was when the Muslims who had gained a foothold up through Spain and such, and actually brought a civilizing influence. The Spanish city of Cordoba was probably the zenith of civilization at that time. Anyway, they were pushed back. And of course, all Muslims and Jews, because it was part of the Inquisition at that time, they had three choices: convert to Christianity, flee the country, or be put to death. You may also remember that just previous to that period was the 100 Years' War between England and France. And soon after that were several other wars. In other words, civilized? Well, I don't know that I would call that very civilized. That seems pretty barbaric to me. So as this colonial empire starts to spread, let's recognize the context and the worldview that they had. It was a might is right type of worldview. Again, every statement I make is going to be such an overgeneralization that's simply unavoidable. And I hope you'll give me a little grace for that. Not everybody was like that, of course. Yeah, Spanish Inquisition already occurring. So it's important for me, at least, to have recognized that people are always contained by their worldview. And within that worldview, they try, at least most, try to act morally. But as time goes on, we can come to recognize just, no, actually, that wasn't the greatest way. And we're going to take a look at one of those specific areas. All right, so before we move on, I've given this adage once before: the clearer our perceptions of reality, the better our chances of success. And in here, that means, as was mentioned, the flourishing of life for all. It's sort of like that hymn, "The Lord has yet more light and truth." That's what we are hopefully always open to. That is essential if we are going to be able to adequately address this issue. And I'll be coming back to that at the very end. So let's get into the definition. Now, the original definition by Oxford, the practice by which a powerful country controls another country or other countries, well, that's just a little too generic. This was a very specific form of that. It had the political aspects where you took or enticed part of your population to go into these colonies and live there and dominate, politically dominate the people who were there. And there was that other aspect, became the economic domination, because once the explorers moved into these lands, they found these valuable resources and they exploited it in a fashion that the country, be it Spain, Portugal, England, France, they got the gain from it, and the indigenous folks remain impoverished. So that's the classic theme. And I just want to mention that if we think it's ended, well, neo-colonialism is what's going on these days. So colonialism in another form is alive and well, but that's going to have to be a topic for another day, 15 minutes. All right. So here's one of the things I wanted to zero in on. The Doctrine of Discovery. I love this because I had no idea about that, you know, when I was in school. Never heard of that one. And it was only recently, the 2016 World Conference, that issue not only arose, but we fortunately repudiated this doctrine. So what's it all about? This was a doctrine that was announced by the Pope as a papal bull. In other words, it has his complete authority, and it allowed explorers to proclaim that they have discovered the land when they, you know, like Columbus, he, you know, thought he had hit India, didn't, but nonetheless, it allowed him to, in the name of the Christian European monarch, in this case Spain, planted a flag in the soil and reported that discovery to the European rulers. He returned to occupy it, and that land then became Spanish. And the indigenous people, it was as if they were non-existent. Have you ever felt like you're in a conversation and you don't exist, or you're in a situation and you don't exist? Think what it would be like to live your life, to live your grandchildren's life, to your ancestors' life, as if you don't, whoops, sorry, accidentally, as if you, but we're coming to this, as if you don't exist. That's what the Doctrine of Discovery did. It was as if these people didn't exist. They didn't, their land wasn't their land. It was newly discovered land. So again, I think some of this is just review, and I'm going to quickly go over here just the progression. Now, it didn't start in 1492, but that's where that rhyme starts. So that's close enough. It started a little earlier, but again, technicalities we just cannot get into. So there we have 1492, the two main countries. I'm not sure whether you can see my cursor or not, but if you can, you know, there you can see France and Spain. were two of the first colonizing countries. Fast forward, not 60 years, you can see South America is getting its land proclaimed in green by the Portuguese, in yellow by the Spanish. Fast forward, actually there's a good 100 or so years, most of South America, but take a look at North America. Now, of course, that's just before the US becomes a country. So part of it has been, quote, discovered, and the indigenous peoples have, well, I'll get to a quote later on that one. But you can see the changing things as we go through. 1885 is a special year. We'll come back to that in a minute as well. Take a look at Africa. You can see they're landing on the shores and starting to move inland, but an awful lot of it is completely unknown. We'll come back to that in a minute. And then by 1914, look at Africa, it's completely claimed by other people. So that gives you just a sense of that period and how the colonialism actually moved out. It started with Spain and Portugal, and well, primarily Spain and Portugal, and then they were taken over mainly by France and England. And then, as you know, England ended up basically the winner, and you had the eventual British Empire. Now, wanted to take a look at an actual quote. So this is a governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. He assured the settlers they could take land freely on this very grounds, concluding from the decimation of native people after the smallpox epidemic, the Lord hath cleared our title to what we possess. By the 18th century, the spread of the pathogens was integral to colonial bipolitical warfare against native peoples. War itself, in this view, was only an apparent evil, ultimately bringing progress and much of the real good, as Ray put it. So I wanted to start bringing in then that intertwining of this colonial, military, and exploratory and business-oriented exploitation that is intertwined, again, started with that doctrine of discovery, which, by the way, was in force even in the 20th century. Unfortunately, I didn't get the slide in on that. But that's how pervasive it has been. But there you see a quote. My gosh, to think that a smallpox epidemic that wipes people out was the Lord's doing. Well, as I say, worldviews are what they are, and it's good to at least recognize where they have come from. Okay, let's keep going. So, well, actually, I'll come back to a summary in a minute. But up until now, we're still looking quite a ways in the past. Question right now is, who insisted that no great wrong has been done to the Red Indians of America by the fact that a stronger and more worldly race, that would be us in the West, has come in and taken their place? Now, unfortunately, because I'm not at home, I'm on the road, so I can't see any of you. Otherwise, I would ask the question, do you know who said that? But I wouldn't be able to see. So I'll just give you the answer. That was Winston Churchill. So Colonialism's legacy leaves long, long tentacles. And it, as I say, continues on in various forms today in neo-colonial forms. In other words, the extractive industries that Susan just mentioned, those still go on, and they will simply leave when possible and leave all the mess to any of the indigenous peoples that remain. Now, I wanted to mention the slide of 1884. If you remember, they were just ringing Africa at that time. That was the conference where the European powers, pardon the spelling error there, partitioned Africa according to their own desires. In other words, they chopped it up just according to whatever way they wanted to. And that has caused incredible agony and pain and death and dislocation, because they would just draw a line that, for instance, between Sudan and Chad, they drew a line straight down through a tribal community, and one side ended up in one country, one side in another country. One was for France, one was for England. They didn't care. It was all according to what valued them. So that's part, again, of the decisions that were made, the way that they were made, and the result was just incredible. Now, wanted to tie in one other aspect, and that's the Industrial Revolution, because that ties us more clearly into climate change, because we recognize that the Industrial Revolution brought in iron, coal, and the textiles. So there starts the rise of your CO2 and all of the other toxic aspects. And then the late 19th and 20th centuries brought in another round of natural resources, this time rare earth metals that involve child labor and issues like that. And then the synthetics from oil. Oil then replaces coal. And from that then comes all the plastics. So just think of that Industrial Revolution. Of course, it did create some good things, but my gosh, what an incredible, horrible legacy is again, intertwined in all of that. Okay, so just a quick summary then. The indigenous peoples, and again, sweeping generalizations, I just have to leave it at that, overstated at times, but just want to make sure it comes through. They had no rights, they had no land, though, as I say, there were some who were advocating on their behalf, but very mottled, mixed up, and didn't go anywhere. They lost all their land, suffered high death rates, had land exploited for its resources, sometimes had to help extract the resources too, to zero benefit for themselves. They never got anything. Of course, there was slavery. And at the end of colonialism, when they finally gave the land back to those chopped up lands that they created, what a mess that was. But on top of that, they often left despots ruling, always to the advantage of the colonists. I wish I could go in and give you some of the horrifying examples, but again, it's more of just a reminder and hopefully an intriguing coaxer for you. So thanks for that. And with that, then we'll move on to Susan's story.
Thank you, Rod. So I want to take you back to Makatea. Can you see this? Somebody give me a heads up, a thumbs up. Okay, good. All right. And I want to begin with climate change. French Polynesia has been experiencing the effects of climate change for decades. In the late 1900s, Villages began noticing the rise in sea level and the decrease in beach fronts. Many of the islands in the South Pacific are coral atolls. When Earth movement causes upheavals, these masses of coral are thrust above ocean level, but just barely. They can accommodate plants and human life, but often the highest point of the atoll is only 4 feet. When the sea rises, it floods wide expanses of shallow beach and villages. When tsunamis come, the effects are mass destruction with no place to take refuge. Other islands are volcanic cones with mountainous terrain in the center, providing higher elevations for villages. The government of French Polynesia began making plans 20 years ago to relocate people off of atolls onto higher volcanic islands. That process has accelerated in recent years. Makatea is one of only 10 coral atolls in the Pacific Ocean that have been lifted up by geological forces high above the beach level. The tall cliffs of Makatea originally had flat tops where people could live, farm, and expand. But those cliffs are now the extraction zone, a third of the island. If the extraction zone could be reclaimed, Makatea could become a climate refuge for people on neighboring islands that are vulnerable to sea level rise. I can't tell you how the story of Makatea ends. It's ongoing. I can tell you that when I visited in 2012, Mayor Julian Mai told me that a committee of island residents had worked with him on a radical proposal for remediation of the extraction zone. They found an Australian company to finish the work that had been done in the past, but in a more sustainable way. The company proposed a solution that had been used successfully on Nauru, also suffering from phosphate mining by the international conglomerate. The limestone pinnacles and toxic soil could be scraped off. The mining company could keep any residual phosphate gleaned from the debris, provided they would remove the waste with sustainable methods, avoiding contamination of water, air, and land. The company would fill in the holes with rock to level the ground. It would lower the top of the island by 6 to 8 feet, but it would create a flat surface where the mining company would plant indigenous vegetation and trees with the help of the Polynesians. Greening the landscape would decrease the scorching effects of heat and build new soil. Test farms had already been built when I was there. An experimental solar farm was successfully harvesting the most constant source of energy in the islands, the sun. Plans for additional solar farms were being drafted. With a full third of the island rehabilitated, there would be lots of room for the transplant of island populations to Makatea's heights as the sea encroached on their villages. They would build roads, a new port, an airstrip, making the island more accessible. It would create jobs. The vision was the greening of the island, the remediation of the extraction zone, and a transition to clean energy with a keen eye on keeping the carbon footprint low. After 2 years of positive research, the company applied for a mining concession, which triggered a governmental review of French Polynesians' entire mining code. The proponents called it a rehabilitation. The opponents call it a disaster. Around the world, people rallied around arguments to prevent additional mining of any kind on Makatea. How could the tourist industry survive with all the industrial activity going on? How could geologists study ancient corals, echinoderms, and mollusks if the pinnacles are destroyed and the mining holes filled? A French professor scoffed at the idea that the remedial efforts would pay for itself. Some people proposed to make Makatea a protected ecological niche, just as it is, to recover on its own. Some Europeans want to preserve the unique history of extraction, colonization, and destruction like a museum. Over 250,000 people around the world have signed a petition against the new mining project, casting the venture as one more example of greed without responsibility. What is missing is the dialogue with the indigenous people. The UN issued its Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People in 2007, which includes the right to pursue their development in keeping with their own needs and aspirations, promote their full and effective participation in all matters that concern them and their right to remain distinct, and to pursue their own visions of economic and social development, unquote. In 2016, whoops, what happened? Here we go. In 2016, Community of Christ passed resolution World Conference number 1309 that denounced the doctrine of discovery and supported self-determination and the UN Declaration. That resolution brought these concepts to the awareness of Community of Christ members around the world, and I hoped it would help. But the situation on Makatea had become ambiguous and complex when protests began. Self-determination was swept aside, and colonialism still has a grip, with Europeans still wanting control. Arguments to prevent remedial mining use the ecologic abhorrence of mining to achieve European agendas, an example of greenwashing. The truth is, geological exploration can occur anywhere on the island. Rehabilitation would promote, not negate, biodiversity and the return of species. If the local population wished to preserve a small segment of the extraction zone as a museum to commemorate the era of mining, provide a warning, and attract tourists, it could be done, while the rest is restored to health. The project has remained in limbo ever since 2016. The mining permit has been neither approved nor rejected. The deadline for an official decision keeps getting extended, so no work has begun. Mayor Mai and many of the local residents believe the remedial mining solves multiple problems. Filling the holes is an important symbol of healing, as well as a practical way to level the land and then rebuild its soil. Restoring the original vegetation will encourage the return of wildlife and biodiversity. Rehabilitating the cliffs will provide sanctuary for flooded villages on other islands. And moving to solar energy is a win-win for the people, the earth, and the future. Over the past few years, both proponents and opponents have organized public meetings on Makatea and neighboring islands in Tahiti in preparation for a public consultation that could begin any day. On one side is a handful of indigenous Polynesians who have created a solution they believe to be healing, ecologically sound, and green. On the other side are European experts, tourists, historians, scientists, and outside interests who bring their own agendas to bear on the island's future. On both sides are caring individuals who abhor the damage once done. Which solution will bring healing and wholeness? Which solution will turn Makatea into another sacrifice zone, subject to the needs of the colonizing mindset? What is the future for Makatea? I wish I knew.
Thank you, Susan. We have now just a few minutes for a few questions that people might have of either of Rod or Susan. Obviously, we have an example in Susan's material of a particular instance in which the interests of a dominating culture and the interests of indigenous culture are in conflict, and what remains is how they will be resolved. And behind that, the background of the 400+ year history that Rod outlined for us. So I want to open it up for just a question or two. If you want to raise your hand, I'll look for a hand raised, or if you want to put it in the chat. Judy? I'm sorry, did you raise your hand? No, I didn't. That was me. Anyone have a question or a comment?
Dan Knotts.
I was thinking of a situation up in Calgary, Alberta, The Bow River goes through Calgary. It goes through Blackfoot Crossing, right through the Blackfoot Reservation, southeast of Calgary, I believe. And there was a treaty signed there at Blackfoot Crossing where they had a big notch cut out of the hill there so they could put cannons up there to make sure that they signed the treaty. But as a former member of NACAT, we would go there and they always had a large powwow grounds there in that area. But the river, when I first went there, you could swim in that river. It came right out of Calgary and went through there. And the last time anybody I knew was there, I mean, from the States, when they swam in that river, they all got sick from the pollution coming out of Calgary. And, you know, I can remember the first time I went there, you would bob up and down in the river, hitting the bottom and coming to the surface, and it was exhilarating. You know, the water was fast, pretty clean, you know, relatively. And the last time, you know, everybody that got in the river got sick, you know, and that right through the middle of the reservation there. And, you know, Clifford Crane Bear, Mervyn Wolfleg, and Agar, Muffwig, and Gerald Sitting Eagle, and those were some of the native guys that were there, Nate. But, you know, I don't know how they're doing or, you know, what the situation is there now, but every once in a while I think about that, and I think of that, how bad it was. You know, that was probably 30 years ago when I was there, and then what it could be like now, it just makes me shudder to even think about it, you know. But anyway, I wanted to mention that because I think of it from time to time and wonder, you know, I haven't.
Thanks, Dan.
Yeah.
I think in the interest of time, we're going to move on now to another presentation.
Okay.
Paul Bethel is going to give us another example of the challenges that we face as we're now moving into consideration of how we mitigate and adapt to climate change, how we deal with the question of who benefits and who suffers in that process. So Paul, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you. Let me share my screen here. So can everybody see what appears to be 7 falling rocks? Okay. So those aren't falling rocks. That's a satellite view of the Hawaiian Islands. Hawaii is the only U.S. state that is situated in the tropics. In Honolulu, you know, the high temperature ranges winter and summer from the high 70s to the mid 80s. The low temperatures, the high 60s to the mid 70s. For the rest of the world, if I did my arithmetic correctly, that would be a high temperature range of between 25 to 29 degrees, and the low temperature ranges between 19 and 24. So some might call the Hawaiian Islands a paradise. And my personal testimony, if you live in Chicago or in Kansas City, or for that matter, Toronto, and you were fortunate enough to visit Hawaii in December, you too would swear it's a paradise. So this is the Moanalua Valley, and it runs down towards Pearl Harbor. And it's along the mountainside of this valley that the US military started building an underground fuel storage facility in 1940. It's named the Red Hill Underground Fuel Storage Facility. So the storage tanks were dug into the rock, each as tall as a 20-story building. So I'm not sure if you can read the small print, but each tank is 100 feet wide and 250 feet tall. So the tank was blasted out of the rock, and then it was lined with a 1/4 inch steel membrane. So a 1/4 inch, that's the width of a pencil. And I don't mean the fat pencil that we used in first grade. I mean the skinny pencils that you used in high school. And if you look at that enlarged cutout, there's essentially fuel, that 1/4 inch of steel, and then rock. So the fuel runs through an elaborate system of pipes and tunnels that carry it to the Navy base down below the valley. Now there's 20 of these tanks. All 20 tanks are buried underground, and they're capable of storing 250 million gallons of fuel. You can see the kind of the silhouette of where those tanks are in the side of the mountain. The Sierra Club claims the 73 reported fuel leaks over the years since 1943, when the facility was commissioned, amounts to roughly 180,000 gallons of spilled fuel. Now, that's only the reported leaks. The one thing that you really have to have if you have a paradise is water. So most of the drinking water on the island comes from the freshwater aquifer underneath Oahu. The water filters down through the lava rock, making Hawaiians claim that their water is the purest and the sweetest in the world. Now, while it's seemingly true that it rains somewhere on Oahu every day, somewhere, climate change is still having an impact on Hawaii. Annual rainfall has been decreasing steadily over the past several decades. This affects the volume of water in that aquifer. An additional concern is the sea level rise. With the rising sea level, that affects the zone of salt water under the fresh water. The brackish mixture above the zone encroaching on the fresh water above it. Oops. Okay. Now, the University of Hawaii claims that Hawaiians have over 200 different words for rain. I've read some articles that had it up as many as 700, but a quote from one of the University of Hawaii's papers: the symbiotic relationship between land and language is displayed in details such as how many words and terms exist in Hawaiian for rain alone, more than 200. This breadth of rain names are specific, descriptive, and highly nuanced, a reminder of how keenly and thoughtfully ancient Hawaiians observed and were connected to their environment. With these words, they distinguish Hawaii's rains in a multitude of colors, or in a multitude of ways: color, intensity, duration, what time they arrive, what time they leave, the angle or the path they'd fall in, and how certain rains are linked to a place or an area throughout the island. There literally are books on the subject. And just a note, the legal prohibition from teaching or using Hawaiian, enacted after the invasion and the overthrow of the kingdom, was finally rescinded in 1986. So the Hawaiian word for freshwater is wai. In January of 2014, Red Hill had a 27,000 gallon leak that stirred public sentiment and resulted in the Navy being instructed, in addition to the EPA, to comply with the Hawaii Department of Health criteria. Prior to that, the Navy was not obligated to comply with any local ordinances. Of major concern was that the fuel tanks rest just 100 feet above that aquifer that provides drinking water to most of Oahu. So this began a 7-year stalemate of claims that leaks can't happen anymore, accusations of being out of compliance, claims of inaccurate reporting, claims of magical remedies that won't work. When your language has over 200 names for rain, water is obviously important to you. The millions of gallons of jet fuel sitting right above their supply of Hawaii, and the Navy's seemingly lack of awareness or concern for the dangers the fuel tanks posed, small local groups have protested for decades. But protests became more prevalent after that massive 2014 leak and has slowly escalated. Then last year, a series of mishaps expanded the circle of concern and protests. So a major showdown was coming. First, there was a 1,000-gallon leak in May. Then in October, just before a hearing with the Hawaii Board of Health, reports that the Navy knew about but did not report that fuel had been slowly leaking into Pearl Harbor since March of 2020, well over a year. Then in November of last year, over the Thanksgiving weekend, there were complaints from users of the Navy's water system of fuel odor in their water. So at first, the Navy told the primarily military housing users that there was nothing wrong, telling the service families the same story that they used for the Hawaii Board of Health hearings, that the Navy has a constant leak monitoring system that prevents such a leak from occurring. Well, social media lit up. The Armed Forces Housing Advocates, this is a group that services military families, reported getting complaints from 456 households. Even though the Navy said nothing was wrong, common sense prevailed. The Holy Family Catholic Academy and Preschool, they shut down. Nimitz Elementary blocked access to all the drinking fountains and the sinks in the school. The Navy claimed they had tested the wells and reported, quote, there was no smell or sign of fuel or chemicals in the water at the Navy's water wells and water tanks. Finally, a week later, on December 2nd, the Navy announced that tests had detected trace amounts of fuel and volatile hydrocarbons in the wells closest to Red Hill. The Honolulu Board of Water Supply shut off their wells closest to Red Hill. Now the voices raised in concern included military families, and the crisis gained an even wider audience both on and off the island. So not only the native Hawaiians, but a growing number of residents were starting to get really upset.
We are building a structure, a religious structure called a ko'a. And a ko'a is a traditional structure that when resources are low, it's a structure and a process by which we draw resources to us. And the resource for this ko'a that we're looking for is we're looking for awareness. We're looking for people. We're looking for solidarity to make sure that we all the people of Hawaii who live, especially on Oahu, can unify around stopping the desecration of our aquifer.
The way we protest, the way we ku'e, is by honoring our land and our gods and our people by mele and chants and songs and dances. We sound like we're singing joyfully, and we are, but a lot of that is hidden meaning that we're not really talking about the beautiful flower or the beautiful the rain. We're talking about the pouring rain, the impact that it has on our land. We're talking about people that have been detrimental to our land. So while that may be cultured or hidden in the way we sing and the way we dance, it's still very stinging to those of us in the know.
We have seen that the United States military has not been the appropriate partner to take care of our most precious resource that every peoples around the world knows. It is water. This ko'a will remain up until such time that the U.S. military moves all of the fuel out of those tanks and removes those tanks.
I live in this ahupua'a. I live in Aiea. So the aquifer, Halava, and Aiea is my watershed. That's my land. And so to have somebody polluting my water, where I raise my kids, where I expect my grandchildren to be living. So this is important to me and the future generations of my family. We're not planning to leave. We're not going to give up our aina.
This was the product of the Navy, the U.S. military contaminating our drinking source here on Oahu. This isn't the first time that they've done that. They've done that to the island of Koho'olave. They are doing it anywhere that the military is based in the islands. There is some kind of environmental degradation.
Yes, on this island, the U.S. military occupies about 22% of the land, so it's one of the largest landholders by far, and most of its land is Superfund sites, it's super contaminated. So not only is Red Hill or Kapukaki one of those places that's being contaminated, Pearl Harbor, which is directly across from us, is also a Superfund site. It was also found several years ago that they had buried chemical weapons on our lands as well to dispose of them. They also have bombed and left live ordnance all over our land, including Pohakuloa and Makua Valley. Whenever they bomb land that is sacred to us, they continue to bomb it even after our protests. This is the same they've been doing since they occupied Hawaii and overthrew our kingdom. They did it to Koho'olave and we pushed them off there. They've done it to Makua Valley and Pohakuloa and other sacred lands. And of course they're going to continue doing it here because to them, their need to wage imperialist wars across the Pacific supersedes their need to provide fresh water even to their own troops, but especially to the people they occupy.
And what do you say to the Navy command, the military command, who's saying they don't need to shut down the tanks, they'll just make sure this doesn't happen again and assure you that the problem's going to be fixed?
Yes, they've been saying that for decades now. And at what point is enough enough?
I think they're used to getting away with whatever they want to without repercussion, that there's so many exemptions and exceptions for the military, and I think that for a lot of people it's shocking to know that they consider the people, the community here to be just the cost of doing business, that it's more important for them to be quote-unquote mission ready, which for us is not a small thing. That they're using our islands to practice killing other people we're not okay with that. But I think people are really shocked to know that they're willing to risk the health of the people here as well, who they claim to protect.
And what it boils down to, I mean, let's not dance around the issue. Money. It's like putting a price tag on our drinking water, which is ultimately putting a price tag on our lives. These Navy folks, these Navy personnel, these commanders and admirals and lieutenants and captains, they leave. They're here for 4 years. They're temporary. This is our home. This is where we come from. The Navy has got to shut down Red Hill immediately for good, or they're going to have this entire island against them. They're going to have the entire island of Oahu resisting against them, engaging in civil resistance and civil disobedience. Everyone drinks water. No one can drink jet fuel.
The only appropriate resolution to this is that they remove the fuel from those tanks and remove those tanks from up above, because those tanks will continue to leak and leach whatever residue they have. So anything less than that is not acceptable.
About 2 weeks ago, this memo was released, easing fears of protesters and residents alike. Closure and redistributing the fuel is a win for the water protectors. It is, however, not the same as completely draining and removing the tanks. Unused tanks can still leach into the water supply. So there is still work that needs to be done. So thank you for watching that, and I'd like to turn it over to Joan for one last story.
Thanks, Paul. In Susan's story of Makatea, as in so many other times and places since the beginning of colonialism, indigenous populations were displaced and reduced to economic dependence on the occupying forces, whether those were national, corporate, or military ones. But where did they go? Some were moved within country, some forcibly moved to other countries. Where do their descendants live now? For the next few minutes, we want to consider what has happened to displaced people over generations, what their reality is today, and how that intersects with the evolving realities of climate change. For most of human history, people everywhere lived in very low-density rural settings, where they were in touch with the rhythms of nature and the cultural community of their ancestors. Urbanization.
Excuse me, Joan, we've lost your PowerPoint. Can you share it once again? Excuse me.
Right. I'm working on that. Something just happened, and I'll get it going again. Hold on.
I'll keep going, and we'll get the PowerPoint caught up when it becomes available. Urbanization is a trend unique to the past few centuries, increasing from less than 5% of the global population 400 years ago to 16% 200 years ago to over 60% today, with projections of as much as 80% by 2050. Now, for most of us who are descendants of the colonizing countries, that move to cities has increased our level of prosperity, and we tend to live in spacious, tree-lined suburbs, mostly with air conditioning. However, for those displaced by colonialism and eco-racism, many continue to live in urban poverty. According to the site Our World in Data, today 1 in 3 global city dwellers live in a slum household, and for many of them, their circumstances are because of that original displacement. Pictures such as this one showing the difference between rich and poor sections in Cape Town, Africa, are representative of what is happening everywhere. Cut off from connection with the land and the ancestral communities, and deprived by either policy or suppressed cultures of the educational and economic opportunities available to the dominant populations. The poorest areas of cities everywhere are where those displaced ended up and where so many of their descendants still live today. And in these inner city, whoops, now I've lost my stuff. Technology. In these inner city industrial and downtown areas with fewer trees to dissipate heat and evaporate moisture, and more concrete, brick, and pavement to absorb and reflect back heat, we now have what are referred to as urban heat islands. An urban heat island is an urban or metropolitan area that is significantly warmer than its surrounding rural areas due to human activities. The accepted belief over the past century, since the phenomenon was first described, has been that on a hot day, it will be about 7 degrees Fahrenheit hotter in urban residential areas than in the tree-lined suburbs or parks. The difference is more pronounced at night because of the heat absorbed by the building materials and released at night. Here's a map of the cities around the world that are experiencing those heat islands. And if you're interested in going deeper on this subject, there's lots of good information at publichealthnotes.com. Now, let's add in climate change and the dramatically increasing number of high heat days each year. This photograph of Vancouver, Canada, from July 17, 2004, shows the temperature variation between the green rural area to the north and the purple highest heat zones. And here's a close-up of Vancouver's downtown area, showing the difference between the green of Stanley Park and the variations in the rest of the city. For reference, the green and blue areas have apparent temperatures of less than 24 degrees Celsius or 75 Fahrenheit. That's a nice summer day. The yellow and gold areas range up to 30 Celsius or 86 Fahrenheit, getting hotter. Then the red comes, but the purple is a range of temperatures up to 41 Celsius or 106 Fahrenheit. So in some areas of the city, that was a difference of 31 degrees Fahrenheit. No longer a nice summer day, that's a brutal reality for those living without air conditioning. Remember I said that urban heat islands could rise the temperature in downtown areas by as much as 7 degrees? Climate change events are blowing that out of the water, and that is impacting disproportionately Indigenous populations and their descendants everywhere in the world. And as the heat rises, smog pollution forms and becomes thicker, dramatically increasing the risk of asthma and other chronic respiratory conditions. And Without the ability to cool our bodies at night, many will become ill or die, especially the frail, the elderly, and those working in high heat environments. Now let's add in heat domes, a relatively new weather pattern. NOAA, the U.S. National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, defines a heat dome as being caused when the atmosphere traps hot ocean air as if bounded by a litter cap. They're definitely linked to climate change. The upper air weather patterns are slow to move, and so heat domes can stay in place for many days. While much of the world dealt with extreme heat last June, as shown in this June 29th graphic, the Pacific Northwest of the USA and Western Canada experienced a heat dome event that lasted for 10 days. We're not talking about a part of the world that even 10 years ago anyone predicted would see such extreme heat or that it would last for so long. At the end of those 10 days, there were, according to the CBC website, 1,400 heat deaths. According to the BC Coroner's report, 70% of those heat deaths were persons over the age of 70, and 99% were caused by overheating in a residence or hotel. That means almost all of these heat deaths occurred to populations without air conditioning. Plus, there were billions of sea creatures lost, impacting marine biodiversity and food sources, and devastating wildfires. And even though the cause may be hot ocean air in the upper atmosphere, heat domes can happen inland as well. This could be coming soon to a city near you. The good news is that cities are paying attention and beginning to take action. Whether that's recruiting an army of volunteers to accurately map existing heat zones and tree canopy, or painting roofs with reflective white paint, as in this photo from New York City, or even adding a reflective white emulsion to pavement, as in LA and Atlanta. There are roof gardens and green building envelopes springing up. And then there's Dubai, which has built a downtown wind tower to bring air down to street level and move it through the street, kind of like an extremely large ceiling fan that is helping to make the downtown area 15 Celsius degrees cooler than the surrounding desert. One of the most intriguing ideas I've come across is a grassroots designed and led Vancouver, BC climate change workshop, empowering ordinary residents to take climate action into their own neighborhood. It's designed to bridge the gaps between complex science, distant policy making, and individual climate action by bringing small communities together to learn and walk and plan together, empowering people to make their own choices and decisions. So what's the situation in your city or region? We've just scratched the surface on this topic, but it's something that I would urge each of us to find out more about. And now I'll hand it over to Rod for a quick summary.
You've heard a lot of the consequences, but you've also heard some of the solutions. You've heard some solutions that have worked, some that we're not sure. There's still ambiguity. Will it go one way or will it go the other way? So first of all, I want to thank you for being here, because you are part of that group that is helping tilt it to the positive outcomes that we are wanting. Awareness and recognizing what others are doing, getting those ideas, building that political constituency, that's all part of how change comes about. This worldview that has been built from colonialism that continues through the multinational corporations that Susan showed, as well as the military industrial complexes. We do have power, and it's people like you that I am so grateful for, that you've come here today. And like me, as that childhood student, now going back and learning so much more about what's really going on, because that puts me in touch with reality and helps us take the action needed. So here are 3 things. Renounce the Doctrine of Discovery. Susan mentioned, yes, World Conference, we did that with that Resolution 1309. So that was a great step for the church. But we as individuals need to remember how entwined religion and economics and politics can become, reinforcing the wrong directions. We want to make sure it's reinforcing the right ones. Secondly, you probably have heard of Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, thinking of South Africa and Desmond Tutu. Again, a mixed example, an incredibly positive move, but it's got to continue. There's an example in Canada, can't get into it, but again, it had a very positive effect, but not nearly as large and the scope, the size we needed. So me as a Canadian, I've got to keep at that because it's not finished. And then the final one, the UN Declaration of Indigenous Rights. Again, we did pass that at World Conference in 2016. But passing it is not the same as getting it enacted. That's again where the political constituency comes in, and it all really gets back to that dialogue, moving beyond seeing the other and engaging with all of us as children of God. So there's our 3 examples. You don't, with some introductory links, there's much deeper links, that you don't have to worry about getting it down now. You can take a screenshot or wait for the archive and pick it up there, of things that the indigenous peoples themselves are demanding in terms of all 3 of those things, as well as some of the other things that were mentioned today. So thanks for joining us in this. It is a huge task, but it's when we all start coming together that we can make that difference and joining with others. And with that, then I'll pass it on for some closing thoughts. Sorry.
So I'm going to skip most of my closing thoughts. Because I'm aware that we're already over time, I simply want you to take a look at your heart and recognize that sense of either being overwhelmed and feeling like I can't do anything about this, or feeling a sense of despair that kind of paralyzes you. And at the same time, recognizing that there's a vision before us and possibilities to really be engaged in what Joanna Macy calls the great turning. So I've gotten permission from my teammates to offer you this invitation. This is not a climate justice piece, but let's see if I can get the slides to advance. There we go. Oops, sorry, I got these in the, I guess I don't have that in, here it is. Next weekend, I, as part of the Conversations with the Mystics that the Bend Community of Christ sponsors, I'm going to be doing a presentation on contemplative intuitions for the sacred work of earth keeping. So that'll be at 9 a.m. Pacific time next weekend. If you're interested, Carolyn Brock is the person to contact. You can see her email there so you can get on our list. And I will be exploring the work of Joanna Macy, who's a Buddhist theorist, systems theorist, and Robin Wall Kimmerer, who is a Native American botanist and storyteller. And that will be followed on April 23rd, going deeper into the work of Robin Wall Kimmerer. So I'm just going to let that invitation stand. And if you're at all interested in kind of looking at the way our spiritual life might support the prophetic, invite you to participate with us then. So we do have, of course, our upcoming climate justice events. As was mentioned at the top, on April 3rd, we're going to continue this storytelling that we've been doing. You know, a month or so ago, Ashia, who was our first speaker, very gently invited us into this terrain of storytelling, and we've really done it today, and we've got more to do. But what we would like to say is that just as was shared today, we know you also have stories or places that you're aware of. So if you have 4 or 5 sentences, I'll come back to the Beyond the Walls. I'd like you to feel free to bring those. We'll provide time to do some sharing. And if you have 4 or 5 sentences and a picture that you would like to have shared, that we don't have room for a huge influx, but we would really like to hear from you and hear your stories, you can contact Rod and send those stories to him, and we'll get some of those incorporated into what we offer as a continuing conversation rather than just a follow-up like we usually do. We're going to continue telling stories and continue listening for how we might be engaged. So there's a lot more really good stories to share. And then again, to invite you to the Beyond the Wall online worship service on April 24th, which will, so that weekend of the 22nd is Earth Day, the 23rd will be the second of the 2 mystics conversations on how to become kin to all creation again. And then on Sunday, Joan and Susan will be the speakers, and the rest of the team will be supporting them as we speak to the sacredness of creation as a team. And with that, I'll just say thank you and